Today I'll be discussing the Alger Hiss case from 1948. In order to truly understand the Hiss case, you have to understand the historical backdrop and what was going on in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s, and specifically this controversy over communism. So there was an ideological division within the United States over communism. Some people thought that the US needed to adopt communism, and this was a popular view in the aftermath of the Great Depression because in the Great Depression, we saw high unemployment rates, we saw a lot of poverty, and so the idea is that if the United States adopted communism, that if you look at a pure communist model, the wealth is distributed evenly. There really are no haves and have nots. So, this would be a solution to some of the social problems that existed as a result of the Great Depression. However, that was very much a fringe view. The dominant view that most Americans had was that communism was dangerous, and specifically Soviet communism. That Soviet communism was a threat to democracy, capitalism, and the American way of life. And the reason that people were so afraid of communism was basically because of its history. There was a very hostile takeover of the Soviet Union by communists in 1917. And also, Joseph Stalin and his Soviet Union had been aligned with Hitler during World War II. Now, that was until Hitler tried to take over the Soviet Union himself. But again, people associated communism with the Soviet Union and with the hostile takeover in 1917 and with Stalin. Also, during World War II, we know that there were a lot of spies and there was a lot of espionage. And a big concern was that people in the United States, government officials, and people in power would share secrets with the Soviets, and specifically that they would share nuclear secrets. And J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI at that point, was actually instrumental in kind of pushing this idea. He suggested that the reason the Soviets developed some of the nuclear arms that they had were because they had gotten secrets from government officials in the United States who had willingly shared those secrets with the Soviets, and that these government officials were communists. And so this very much spread the idea that communists were everywhere, that there were communists in our midst, and that they were hiding in plain sight. And the biggest concern was that communists existed within the United States government and that they used their positions either to share secrets with the Soviets or to push communist agendas through that would make the US government more like a communist government. So this was a big concern in the 1930s and 1940s. So one way that you could advance politically, let's say you wanted to advance your political career, would be first off to say that you're very anti-communist, and second, to take the stance that you were going to expose and prosecute and persecute these communist traitors that were in our midst. And so many artists and celebrities were persecuted as communists. Now, in hindsight, looking back, we know that a lot of them were innocent, and that these allegations just weren't true. But this is what was going on in the 1940s at the time that the Alger Hiss case went on trial in 1948. And so this is the backdrop, and it's important to understand why Hiss was so vilified, why the allegations against him were so serious, and also why the case was so famous at the time that it occurred. So the Hiss case really got started in 1948. Alger Hiss was an employee who worked for the State Department. He'd actually been employed by the State Department since 1936. And in 1948, a gentleman named Whittaker Chambers came forward and alleged that Alger Hiss was a communist and that he was a spy and that he had helped Chambers smuggle classified State Department documents to the Soviets. So Chambers himself was a former member of the Communist Party. He did have connections with the Soviets, and he did smuggle classified secret documents to the Soviets in the 1930s. However, over time, Chambers became disillusioned with communism, and ultimately he decided to denounce communism, and he became a patriot. And as a part of this, as a part of being a patriot, he came forward and outed communists that he knew about that were working in the United States government. And so that's really why he came forward and levied these allegations against Alger Hiss and ultimately some other folks. But most of the allegations had to do with Hiss. And Chambers claimed that Hiss used his position in the State Department to access classified documents, and that Hiss photographed these documents or retyped them, and then gave these photographs or these retyped copies to Chambers so that Chambers could smuggle them to the Soviet Union. So obviously, these were very serious allegations, and these allegations came out in a series of very highly publicized congressional hearings that were broadcast on the radio and also on television. So Hiss vehemently denied these allegations and, in fact, claimed that he didn't even know who Whittaker Chambers was and why Chambers was telling these bizarre stories about him. Eventually, it did come out that Hiss did, in fact, know Chambers and that they had been friends, and there was some irrefutable evidence to show this. And so it very much undermined Hiss's credibility, even though none of the more serious allegations against Hiss were proven. Still, it damaged his credibility very badly. In terms of understanding the allegations that Whittaker Chambers was making against Hiss and Hiss's rebuttal, I had a student several semesters back who was trying to understand the case make a very good point, and she said, "This case is almost like he said, he said." So, in other words, you have these highly publicized hearings in which Whittaker Chambers is making these allegations about Hiss, and then Hiss in another hearing would rebut these allegations. So it was very much a he said, and a back and forth exchange between Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss. Also, another thing that occurred during this period of time is we saw the involvement of Richard Nixon. So, Richard Nixon, as I'm sure you know, would go on to be the president of the United States in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and eventually he resigned after the Watergate scandal. But in the 1940s, he was a senator from California, and he was looking to um, advance his political career. And so he attached himself to the Alger Hiss investigation very early on. And he believed strongly that Hiss was guilty, but he also probably wanted to advance his career as well. But he very much was instrumental in pushing forward the case against Alger Hiss. Even though in the beginning some of the evidence was rather weak, it was just pretty much Chambers' word against the word of Alger Hiss. Ultimately, though, in the case, Hiss couldn't be prosecuted for treason or espionage because the statute of limitations had expired. So instead, the government was able to successfully prosecute Hiss for perjury because they were able to prove that he lied under oath. First, he lied during one of the congressional hearings when he claimed that he did not know Whittaker Chambers, and yet there was evidence that contradicted this. He also lied and said that he had not stolen State Department documents. However, there was evidence that was shown that those State Department documents had been retyped on Hiss's typewriter, likely at his house. So he did technically steal them by taking them home. So he was convicted of perjury, ultimately got a slap on the wrist type sentence, and was released after serving 44 months in federal prison. Um, the case, however, was very famous due to the context of the time. These allegations that were made against Hiss, this was probably the worst thing that you could accuse somebody of. And so people were very interested in the allegations, and specifically that somebody who had a trusted position working for the state could actually do something this terrible and this conniving by sharing secrets with the Soviets. Also, we see some mystery and ambiguity in the case, is a constant theme here. So Hiss always maintained that he was innocent up until the time he died in 1996. And he claimed that basically that he was a victim of a number of forces. One, the paranoia and the hysteria over communism that existed at that point in time, and that he was implicated even though he wasn't a communist. He also claimed that he was the victim of Whittaker Chambers and that Chambers was psychotic. And he was the victim of Richard Nixon, who Nixon was very much just looking to advance his career. Ultimately, Hiss never did see his name cleared, and it's probably not something that will ever be satisfactorily resolved. But anyway, that kind of wraps it up for the Alger Hiss case. If you have any questions about the case or any comments, I encourage you to reach out to me. You can shoot me an email, and I would be happy to address any questions or concerns you might have, or also just to discuss the case should you want to do that. So that pretty much wraps it up for Alger Hiss.